Hi everyone, it's Miss Chambers, and today we're going to talk about the scientific method, but we're going to focus today on how you can make sure that an experiment is controlled using the scientific method. So if you remember, the scientific method is a way for scientists to organize experiments. And so today we're going to use a new example. We're going to talk about this example. What if a teacher wanted to see if a student's grades improved when the students studied? They could set up an experiment for this. And remember, we talked about before, good experiments change only one variable. A variable is a condition or part of an experiment. And there's always two variables in every experiment: the independent variable, which is the one that is changed, and then the dependent variable, which is measured or counted. And you kind of like see what happens based on how you change that independent variable. So in this experiment, you would have two different variables, just like always, an independent and a dependent. And then one thing that you can do is you can simplify the question in order for you to easier identify the independent and the dependent variable. And this is the format that you can use. It is, what is the effect of blank on blank? And in the first blank, it would be your independent variable. And in the second blank, it would be your dependent variable. So in this case, we're trying to see if studying harder or if studying affects the student's grades. So your independent variable would be studying, because we're trying to see what is the effect of studying on, and in this case, we're trying to see their grades or their test scores. So what is the effect of studying on test scores? And in this way, it's very easy to identify the independent and the dependent variable. The independent is studying and the dependent is test scores. Whenever you do this and you start setting up the experiment, it's kind of easy at this point to identify what is what we call the experimental group and your control group. And I'm going to talk about what these two words mean. So first of all, in order to make sure that we have changes that are easier to see, scientists always set up what we call a controlled experiment. And basically, a controlled experiment sets up the experiment into two groups: an experimental group and a control group. In our case, the experimental group is the one that has the change in the independent variable. It's the part that's actually changed, or the part that's tested. In our experiment, we're trying to see the effect of studying on test grades. So our experimental group is going to be studying. It's the group of students that are going to actually be doing the studying. So you have these students and they're going to study and they take their test. And you're like, oh, wow, look at their grades. They averaged an A+ on their tests. That would be your experimental, but you really don't know if it was the studying that made the difference. So you always need something to compare that to. And that's where we get into the control group. The control group is the group that does not have the change in the independent variable. It is also called the untreated group. And it's really important to have this group so that you have something to compare your experimental group to. It's used to compare. So back to our experiment, we have our experimental group, which was the group that was studying. Look how happy they look to be studying. And then you have to have a control group, which in this case, it would be a group of students that are not studying. So they would both do their thing. Some would study, some would not study. They both take the same tests because you want to make sure they're constant. And then you can compare the test grades and see, did the studying actually make a difference? When you have controls, though, there's one thing going on here. Some experiments, you can't always set up a control group. Usually you can, but sometimes you can't. And in the cases when you can't, there are two other forms of controls. One is called a comparison between groups. In this case, this is when you compare results between groups that all receive slightly different types of the independent variable. So a good example of this is, let's say you're going to see if water affects the height of plants. You would take some plants, you'd give them different amounts of water, and you would see what happens to their height. There's really not one control here. There's really not one control and one experimental. There's a whole bunch of different groups. So you're just going to be comparing between these different groups. So that's one time when you can't actually use a control group. The other time is when you have to use what are called standard conditions. And standard conditions is an experiment that has a standard or natural state that has been established by other experiments as a basis to compare. So those are the two times when you can't really use an exact control group. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, just go ahead and ask your teacher. Thanks.